Great. So a bit about KeNOG. It's a volunteer-led community that aims to enhance technical capacity in those areas: network operations, internet security, services, automation, and storage. And the main goal is just to provide a platform for knowledge sharing and capacity building. That is our website there. It has a new look. Thanks to everyone for their input. We've used that to make changes. On behalf of the KeNOG PC, we hope you like the changes and find it a bit easier to navigate. So the plan has been to have monthly activities, which we have done 3 so far. We wanted to do a bit more, but we were not able to do them. But we'll try and catch up on lost time by trying to do a bit more activities or a few more activities before the end of the year. So this year we have 2, or rather this month we have 2 tutorials. This is the first one on RPKI. The next one will be on the 22nd of July. It will be on Let's Encrypt and automating Let's Encrypt certificates. But if you have any suggestions, do reach out to the PC. You can go to the nog.ke website and see the list of PC members there who are all volunteering. And we're always happy to hear your ideas and suggestions on what we can do to improve KeNOG and the work that's the work we're trying to do. So I will stop there and introduce the expert who's going to take us through the RPKI tutorial. His name is Mark Tinker. Mark Tinker is the head of engineering CCOM. Welcome, Mark. Thank you very much for making time for this tutorial. I'll hand over to you to manage the session. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat and we will have a scheduled way of pointing the questions to Mark. Mark, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, as well as to Simon and Michelle for inviting me to this session of KeNOG, and hopefully we can learn something new from each other today. I will jump right into it. Right, so we're going to talk a bit about RPKI, and it's not a very detailed slide set in this one here. It's really just a distillation of what we've experienced over the last 14 years, since 2014, trying to implement RPKI in the CCOM network. So I'm approaching it from that standpoint. And feel free to ask any questions either after or along the way. Right, so basically with RPKI, we've got 3 elements to it. It's basically the RPKI infrastructure itself, which is a certificate-based system that ensures the cryptography belongs to who it says it does, and that all the records associated with it are truthful. We also have the origin validation aspect of it, which is where we try to detect or prevent misoriginations. And then the third aspect of it is AS path validation, which at this point in time has been promised through a concept known as BGP-Sec or BGP security. Unfortunately, there's no working implementation of BGP-Sec at the moment. It's been a work in progress since 2011, 12-ish. So yeah, it's not something that we can talk about right now, but hopefully at some point it does get implemented, because then AS path validation will be, I think, the holy grail coupled with RPKI or origin validation to ensure that we have a more secure BGP. So why is RPKI relevant? Well, we know that about 99% of all misoriginations tend to be accidental. This has been happening for the last 10, 12 years, all these various examples over there. Just 1% of them tend to be intentional. So either way, intentional or accidental, it causes network problems for a lot of operators. So this is the goal of RPKI, to mitigate against accidental or intentional misorigination of IP address space. At the moment, RPKI will not resolve AS path attacks, as we've spoken of before. Again, path validation through BGP-Sec or some other mechanism is what is required here, and we shall be hopeful that at some point the community will bring that to us. Now, when you want to get going with your RPKI setup, the first thing is to create a ROA, which is a route origin authorization. It basically says that these prefixes are allowed to be originated from this AS number. That's really all it does. This is created through your RIR, in which case that is Afrinic on our side, or if you are in another region, it would be using that RIR. The next step is then to implement RPKI validation, which is to install relying party software that is able to validate ROAs that have been created by the rest of the internet. And then you can use that to connect to your routers and tell your routers whether they should accept those routes or not based on their RPKI state. And I'll show you some examples of this. So with Afrinic, the first step you need to do, or needed to do, I'm not so sure, it depends on when you decide to do your ROAs, is to obtain a BPKI certificate. So you do that at your on the My Afrinic website. It's a bit of a process. As you can see, you need to provide a state issued ID, passport, driver's license, or whatever. And then after that, you'll get enrolled and your browser will be certified saying that the laptop you're creating this ROA from is actually yours. So it's a bit of a process. It's a bit clunky, to be honest. The last time, which was the first time we used it in 2014 to create our ROAs, was the last time I've actually used it. I've tried to recreate my BPKI certificate with Afrinic, but it's been a bit painful. That means that there's now a new mechanism that Afrinic are working on that they plan to launch in July of this year, which is this month, which is two-factor authentication. So with 2FA, you don't need to go through this complicated BPKI certificate thing anymore. 2FA will make that a lot more simpler, and you can use all manner of authentication mechanisms like the Google Authenticator, the Microsoft Authenticator, and so on and so forth on your mobile phone or other device to authenticate against the Afrinic website so that you can create your ROAs. So hopefully by the time we are done talking about this today, that will be available from Afrinic, and that will make your lives a whole lot easier. So once your ROAs are created, you can actually use very many mechanisms on the internet to see that the public is seeing that the ROAs are there. I've used a very simple example of the Hurricane BGP tool, where you can see on the right-hand side is basically a tick, which shows that there is an IRR, a classical IRR entry in the WHOIS database, but on the left, there's a key. And that basically says that this has a ROA, which we have verified is correct, according to the records that Hurricane have. So that's an easy way to tell that the rest of the world sees your ROAs correctly. This is an example for IPv6 as well. There's many other mechanisms. There's a number of publicly available RPKI validators online that you can use to detect if your ROA has come out correctly, but this is just a simple one that we also like to use. So that's what happens once it's done. And then for validation, there is, actually I forgot to write, there's a fourth one here. But there's typically 3 that are currently being used around the world. So FORT is one that's being used. Octo RPKI plus Go RTR, which is produced by Cloudflare, is also in use. NLNet Labs are also pushing out Rotinator. But there's another one also that's that I'm about to test now called RPKI Client with Stay RTR. That's also quite popular nowadays as well. So it's about 4 typically. RIPE used to make one. It had 2 versions, version 2 and version 3. It was called the RIPE RPKI Validator, but that one was since discontinued. Well, they've stopped support for it as of last month. So you can still use it, but they're not going to support it anymore. So you recommend that you don't use it. So between these 3 and the 4th one, which I said the RPKI Client and stay RTR. Those would be the 4 that you want to consider as your validation tools. In terms of router support, these are the vendors that I'm aware of that are currently supporting RPKI. The MikroTik one is a bit of a strange one. Excuse me. So I'm not really sure if they're actually doing it correctly or not. They say that they had to, They say that they had to start supporting it in version 6 or version 7. So if there's anyone out there who's tried it on MikroTik and actually knows that it works, you should let me know. But they have reported that they do have some support for it on their version 6 at the moment. So for validation states, what you see on your router is 3 options. You get valid, invalid, or not found / unknown. If it's valid, it typically means that there's a covering rower that was found, and there's a matching AS number that was found for that rower. So that's a valid entry. If it's invalid, it means that a matching or covering rower was found. However, the AS number did not match that rower. So there's no valid AS number for that prefix. So that's an invalid. And that's normally the one that you're looking for. Either it will be a misorigination or it will be an opportunistic hijack. For not found or unknown would be if you don't have a rower. So most of the internet is either is typically in this area where they don't have a rower that's covering their prefixes. So most of the routes you might see out there would be either not found or unknown, depending on what your router decides to write. The sample configuration iOS would be something like this. As you can see, it's not overly onerous. Here you can see that this is how you connect to the RPKI validator. This is what is known as the RTR session, which is router to relying party. And then you'd have a very simple route map statement, which tells you or the router what you want to do with the various RPKI states. So in this case, for example, you are saying that if the RPKI state is invalid, set a local preference of 90. If it's not found, set a local preference of 100. Or if it's valid, set a local preference of 110. In each case, you're allowing all the routes through with the permit here. It can also be a deny, depends on what your routing policy is. In Juniper, it's a little bit more convoluted. This is how you set up the RTR session. You define the RTR route, the RPKI validator IP address. You specify the refresh times, hold times, the ports, and the local IP address, which is typically a loopback. And then for policy-wise, it's a bit more involved. So unlike in iOS, where validation states can be automatically applied, much to your chagrin, in Junos, you have to specifically tell the router about the state. So for example, if in this case, you're saying that for valid routes, if the route is marked as valid, then state it as valid. So you're saying if the RPKI validator is saying that the route is valid, then we're also going to say it's valid and then do other things. Here, if the RPKI validator is saying that the route is invalid, then we shall also say it's invalid. Because until you do this in Juniper, all routes have a state of unknown until you do it. So in Juniper, you have to specifically say what the state of the route is based on the RPKI validation state. Whereas in iOS, as iOS and IOSXE, it's a little bit different. So if you look at the output of a live network, this is a sample I took from this morning. You will see that we have 2 RPKI validators here, both running on IPv4 and IPv6. And you can tell that there's a slight difference in the number of records here, which indicates that there are 2 different validators. So you can see this one here and this one here is Rotinator, and then this one here and this one here are Fort. So you can see there's a slight delta in the number of records that they each have for a number of reasons, and it's something I'm still testing. Ideally, I'd recommend that you use a single validator so that you have some consistency, you don't end up in any problems. But for one reason or another, you might decide to run different vendors, maybe for resiliency or troubleshooting or some other problem that you might be trying to solve. So this is an example of how you can run two different flavors and still come up with some validation information. CECOM operates a technical website called AS37900.net, which is our AS number. And on that is the one I wanted to show you what it would look like if you wanted to consult a router to give you information about your validation state. So if you do that, for example, we are going to check one of our looking glasses based in Nairobi about the validation state of that IPv4/12. And if you look at that here, you will see that each of them, there's two entries, and each of them states that our RPKI state is valid. Okay. In this case, if I do the same for IPv6, you will see also that for IPv6, it also does say the RPKI state is valid. This is for this /32 that we own. So these routers have got RTR sessions, the RPKI validators, and they're able to generate that information based on the state of the ROAs of those prefixes. So any router that is running this can show you that. In terms of Rotinator itself, Rotinator has got a front end like this, as you can see, and it basically shows you the records for the ROAs that you receive from each of the RIRs, all 5 of them. And if you do a check for your one, in our case, our AS number here plus our /12, it will tell you that this is a valid route because it's got a valid ROA. Same for IPv6, you will see this IPv6/32 also has a valid route. So some of the RPKI validators do come with an inbuilt GUI that can give you a front end like this. Some of them don't, like Fort, which doesn't. I'm not sure if they'll be providing one. Hopefully they do. So some things that you need to be careful about, and this we've come through with a bit of experience over the last few years. One of them is the Arion Trust Anchor Locator. And basically what this one is that for Arion, if you want to use their tile, you have to agree to their relying party agreement, which basically says that you indemnify them in case there's an issue where you might be implicated legally for using using their tile to create your RPKI policy. So why is that a bit of a concern? It might or might not concern you depending on how importantly you take legal stuff. But for example, that basically means that if, let's say, your network decides to block an Arion IP address for one reason or another that was caused by RPKI, you could come under legal scrutiny by some American law firm as to why that happened, something like that. So they are the only RIR that have this requirement. None of the rest do. It's been a long-standing discussion in the community since 2015, I guess. And for some reason, it doesn't seem to go away. Obviously, if you're in the Arion region, it doesn't matter because that's your provider for address space. But in the rest of the world, it might have an impact, especially when you see things going around like GDPR, or recently in South Africa, the POPI Act, which is all about how you protect user data and so on and so forth. So this is something to think about, maybe to run past your lawyers. A lot more coverage. What I do need to point out is that if you don't use the Arion tile, then you're not going to get full coverage. You're not going to get full coverage if you don't use the Arion tile as well. So that's one thing to remember. Another thing to look out for is how iOS and IOSXE. Now this applies only to iOS and IOSXE for Cisco. It doesn't apply to IOSXR. So the thing to note here is that iOS and IOSXE by default apply policy to a route based on an RPKI status. So if your router has an RTR session to an RPKI validator, and it sees that, okay, this route is valid or invalid or not found, iOS and IOSXE will automatically apply policy. Now, the RFC says that this should not happen, and most vendors actually do it correctly, including Cisco actually with the IOSXR. But with IOSXE and iOS, they don't. They automatically apply policy, which is bad. And if you look at this next page, you will see that actually part of the BGP best path determination final state machine in iOS is to look at RPKI state, meaning that a route that is valid is chosen first, a route that is not found is chosen next, and the route that is invalid is by default not installed in the routing table. So it's very cheeky that Cisco, are doing this, automatically instead of allowing the operator to make the choice themselves. This has been an issue since 2014, 15, and even in 2021, it still exists today. So if you are running iOS and IOSXE, and you need to run RPKI on those devices, then this is something to also think about. There are workarounds and there are things that you can live with, but it's important to understand that this is how Cisco do it on these two different sets of software. On IOSXR, it's not a problem. IOSXR, it doesn't define it for you automatically, but in iOS and IOSXE, it does. As you can see, this is an email I sent to a friend at Cisco back in November of 2014. They promised to fix it. It's 2021, still a problem. Okay. The other issue that you also get with iOS and IOSXE is that all iBGP sessions on routers that are running RPKI will mark all those iBGP routes as valid. Okay, so this is something that Cisco also does by default. Again, the RFC says that it should not be done, but they do it anyway. So this can be a bit of a problem when, for example, you have a router that has an iBGP session with, say, a route reflector, but then has an eBGP session with another network, right? So that network obviously potentially doesn't have a ROA. So the routes coming from it are marked as not found, but then you're receiving the same route via your BGP route reflector on iBGP, which is obviously automatically marked as valid because it's an internal route. That then means that the route reflector entry is preferred over the closest entry. So instead of handing the traffic off to the network locally on the same router on the same port, you're sending it across the network to go somewhere else. We have run into this problem ourselves when we used to have a Cisco peering router, like in Tanzania, I believe. So these are some of the things to think about if you're using iOS or IOSXE with RPKI. Another thing to consider is for Junos, which is the Juniper operating system, if you decide to use the BGP communities to convey RPKI state between routers in the same network, then there is an issue where Juniper will not do that correctly if you're running a release prior to the ones mentioned here. So if you have a release earlier than this and you're going to use BGP communities to convey RPKI state, then you can run into this problem. Typically, I would say don't use the community mechanism to transport RPKI state because it creates a dependency in your network. The beauty about RPKI is that you can have an RPKI validator as a server, and then you just have RTR sessions with every router to the server, right? So every router can have a direct session with the RPKI validator. It's not a lot of impact to the server because the servers are pretty quick. So each router can receive its own copy of the RPKI state. Whereas if you decide to convey it via iBGP, in BGP communities, then you create a dependency where if an issue happens with the router conveying the BGP state via communities, the RPKI state via communities, then you impact any other router that depends on that. This could be either software issues like this, or a vendor difference, or whatever. So in this one, I really recommend that, because every router has the ability to be an island on its own, but yet have the same view of RPKI state globally in the network, that makes a lot more sense to not use this method. But again, if you do, this is something to consider. So in terms of RPKI in Africa, again, we haven't been traveling since last year, so I don't know if anything has changed, and maybe Kevin and Michelle and Simon can clue me in. But as far as I know right now, publicly, it would be CCOM and Work Online who have announced that they are dropping RPKI invalid routes since 2019. I know that Liquid was supposed to be doing it as well with us, but that didn't happen for some reason or other. And if there's any others who are now doing it or are just about to do it, it would be nice to know, so that we also add it to this list, because it's great when customers know that they can get that kind of support if they require it. Obviously, around the world, there's a lot of networks that have started doing it in the last 12 months. NTT, Telia, AT&T, and so on and so forth. So all the major ones, CenturyLink, have all started doing it as well.
Yeah, Mark, just a point there. I think Safaricom started doing that, and I'm sure they are doing a couple of them. I see Samuel Miruka, probably sometime you might be able to mention if it's completed or not.
Okay, no, that's good. That's good. The more the merrier. So I mean, if anybody needs help or support in getting that such set up on their side, please feel free to reach out to either, us at CCOM, people at Work Online, even Liquid. And again, if Safaricom are doing it as well, please reach out. The more the merrier. And yeah, so that's really it. I didn't want to get into too much detail, so we can spare more time for Q&A, because I know there's been a lot of RPKI sessions going around. But yeah, that's just an overview around how you can get it going by creating ROAs, how you can get it going by setting up your RPKI validator, setting up your router, and again, testing it all. And then there's really nothing to it after that. It's actually not that complicated, really. And that's what I was trying to convey here. So I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has some.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that presentation. Now we can have the Q&A session. I see one question from Michelle. Michelle, you want to ask? I can ask for you. Okay, let me ask for Michelle. So Michelle's question is, what kind of common issues do people run into when operating RPKI?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks, Michelle. So I think the ones that I showed here tend to be the typical ones. So these are the ones that I was talking about towards the end. This Arion one is a big one. If your company has legal issues or concerns about it, that is obviously one issue that you need to think about, one non-technical issue. And then obviously this iOS and IOSXE drama is a big one. And I think that's probably the biggest issue that I feel exists right now. So, if you're using iOS or IOSXE, you need to think about this. This is the biggest concerns. If you're using Juniper or any other vendor, you don't have to worry about that. Then, yeah, I mean, this, just going back to this one about the BGP communities, which I said really, just don't do it. Just don't transmit RPKI state via BGP communities. I mean, it's an unnecessary complication that you don't really need to have. A server can, I mean, we have about, for example, in CCOM, we have about 600-700 devices on average, and each of them has an RTR session to 2 servers. So, each server is handling about 700 sessions. So it's, it can scale very well. And again, every device has a view of the whole network. So you're not having a split brain situation. The other thing to think about also is the RPKI software. So if I go back to the options here. So here is where you might have an issue, because sometimes software begins out and then it fizzles over some time. I've experienced, I think, about 3 or 4 options just disappearing after a few years because either people get busy, they can't maintain them, etc., etc. So just be mindful that the validator that you're using today might not be the one you're going to be using tomorrow, either for a number of reasons: security, if it's well written, if the people maintaining it decide to give up, all sorts of things. So that's also another thing to think about. So always be flexible with the validators that you end up using. And where you can, don't find yourself in a position where you're running a validator which is now, too old and out of support, because that will mean that you're compromising the security of your BGP environment.
Thanks, Mark. Second question is from Jeremiah. Jeremiah's question is, what is the impact of dropping invalid routes, especially when other network operators may not be creating their routing objects?
Yeah, so there is so technically speaking, this was measured, I think, by Job Schneider, formerly of NTT, I think a year or so ago. And at the time, it was just, I think, less than a gigabit worth of traffic on their network that time that would have been lost on account of dropping invalids. But because 99% of the invalids that we see tend to be mistakes, there's always a covering route, or there generally is a covering route that's available that will still lead you to the end destination anyway. But commercially, there is an impact where if you are doing it, but your competitors are not, then you would be sending more prefixes down to your customers than you would be to, they would be sending more to their customers than you would be to yours, because they're not filtering the invalid routes, even if they're a misorigination. So it could be that 20 more routes from ISP A versus you, my ISP B, what's the issue, right? That used to be a concern for us back in 2014, 2015, when we began doing this. But to be honest, it's not a major concern anymore. And what we found is that if a route is blocked or dropped by you, which causes an outage or a breakage, which is the biggest issue, it's quite easy to get resolved quickly. I think we've had, 4 or 5 packages because routes were invalid and were dropped, and we had them fixed in less than 30 minutes. Using the net from the originator, who is not even a customer. You find that the person originating the route that a customer is trying to reach is based in Siberia, for example. And you reach out to them and say, hey, you're misoriginating here, you're causing breakage for a customer, can you fix it? It's done in half an hour, right? So we found that it leads to quick resolution of any kind of breakage. So that's why we still keep running it. So those are the kinds of impacts you might see, but in all fairness, none of them are a real showstopper.
Thanks, Mark. Next question is from Paul. Paul asks, what are the prerequisites for creating RPKI routes? For instance, is a valid route object mandatory?
No. So you don't need to have a valid IRR entry in order to create a ROA. Obviously, it is great that you have a valid IRR entry because a lot of networks around the world still filter based on that. Where the world is going to now is a lot of networks are filtering based on an IRR and RPKI. So they create their filters based on, okay, I see you have an RR record and I see you have a ROA. So we create a filter based on that. And there's tools for that now. But no, you don't need to participate in the RR in order to participate in RPKI.
Thanks, Mark. Then Samuel asks, how best can one create alerts or reports on the valid, invalid, and known routes received by a router?
Yeah, so obviously, if you're good at coding, there's many options there. But what you, let me see if so what you can do is, for example, like this. So if you use a validator that has a front end, then you can get this information. For example, you can see Rotinator will give you this front end, and you can see, you know, what it feels, the routes that it sees are marked as valid or invalid or not found. You can also use, I believe, some of the public-facing tools that are out there that capture this information are openly available with APIs. I know Cloudflare's one is. I believe RotView is also doing something. So there's a bunch of them on the internet as well. So you can get this information either locally from your own validator, either with a direct front end like this, or by coding a feedback mechanism directly into your validator. Or you can use the publicly available ones from Cloudflare, from RotViews, from Ripe, you know, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of places. I mean, if you just Google RPKI validator, you'll come up with a bunch of options. So you can get the information very, very readily available, and it will be all current and up to date.
Thanks, Mark. There's an anonymous question. Is it worth, in your experience, is it worth hosting your own delegated RPKI infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's something that we actually thought about in 2014, where you can sort of act as a certificate authority or delegated as Anonymous asks. And that we found has a bit of usefulness if customers are not inclined to creating their own ROAs and instead want to interact with you, and you do it on their behalf with the RIR, Afrinic in this case. So yes, in that case, you know, you do it on behalf of the customer, and you're Afrinic to them directly, if you may. But looking at it, you know, especially now that Afrinic is about to make it simpler to enroll and create your own ROA, there's not much of a difference really, right? If you can create a CA that your customer can use and you can, you know, manage for them on their behalf, then it's quite easy for them to just, you know, open up an account on an Afrinic website and create a ROA themselves. So I think there's an opportunity for both somewhere. I just haven't quite thought about it in great detail lately because it's becoming, you know, it just makes more sense. I mean, if a customer already has an Afrinic account, it just sort of makes sense to continue along there. I'm trying to think of a reason why they would, you know, decide to go through another ISP. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they don't have a big enough team that can spend time of this, but normally if they don't, then they might not be having their own Afrinic account either. So I'm just curious about where it fits in. But yes, there are tools. I think NLNet Labs have done a tool called Krill, and Krill is a CA. So Krill is a CA in that you can provide as a front end to your customers and you can be a CEO on their behalf. So the tools are there. It's just a question of, you know, why you'd want to do it. I'm not saying you don't have to. You just have to think about if it makes sense. It might be a commercial advantage for you, maybe. But for us, we thought about it. And most of our customers are generally most of our large customers that are interested in this are generally ISPs who run their own Afrinic portals anyway. Smaller customers who don't care about Afrinic don't have Afrinic accounts. So, you know, we are sort of in that sort of limbo state at the moment on that. But the tools are there, yeah.
Great, thanks, Mark. No questions at the moment, but I have one question. Yeah. So in your experience, since CCOM started dropping invalids in 2019, have you had an incident where traffic became unreachable and some of your clients are unhappy about that, or some of your downstreams were unhappy about that? How did you handle that situation where you've changed your policy that's been there for a very long time, and it's probably affected some reachability? How was that experience?
Yeah, so interestingly, it wasn't as impacting as we thought it would be when we tried it or when we did it, because this was actually the second time. So the first time we did it was actually in 2015. That time there was only one major RPKI software, which was RPKI.net. It was both a CA and a relying party software. And so we tried it in 2014, 2015. But we had to roll it back because of the Cisco issues that I mentioned earlier, but then also because we basically took away a lot of routes from our table that we couldn't give to our customers anymore, and most people didn't know about RPKI then, so it was just too difficult to explain. But 2019 was the second time, and yeah, we ran into a number of issues. I think in the first week we had, like I said to you, we had a customer who was buying a cloud service from a European company that was announcing their prefixes on their behalf as well. So the customer was a BGP customer in Africa, but was also having their cloud provider announce the IP address space on their behalf also. So the IP address space was being seen from two different paths, from two different origins. The customer's AS number and this other AS number, and the customer had a ROA. So we obviously dropped the other route and they couldn't get to their cloud. But we managed to contact the customer and the cloud provider, and they quickly fixed that. We had another issue, I think, where a customer was unable to get to, what was it? They were unable to get to Cloudflare, I think because of the same issue, especially after Cloudflare just enabled their RPKI, their ROA validation as well. So we've had, I'd say less than 10, less than 10. And what that meant was that we updated our NOC procedures to also check, as part of the troubleshooting process, to first check whether the prefix is inaccessible due to a ROA failure, and if that's the case, fix that first before going to anything else. So the NOC procedures have been updated also based on that. But yeah, it's not been a lot, It's not been a lot. I would say just about 10 or less than since 2019, which is nothing. It's really nothing. Yeah.
Great. That's good to hear. I think Simon Mayoy has a question.
Sure. Yeah. So let me ask on behalf of somebody, based on the issues phase and all that. So since the implementation has a couple of challenges, and you don't know one plus one will be equals to 2 or 3, because one, you have a Cisco, tomorrow you're deploying a Juniper, and you don't know the iOS code that has an issue, so that you may be able to upgrade to another one. You're going with IOSXE and so on. Is there any dashboard that some community have come up whereby I've seen some evangelists for DNS whereby they have a URL, I think is something to do with everything DNS. So in the spirit of encouraging RPKI, do we have some people who come up with like a dashboard, a URL whereby everything is captured, there are challenges, so that somebody can hardly miss or only miss one thing when they start implementing? And I'm talking in terms of, it could be like a community locally, the ones who are in the African region, or even if it's globally, but somewhere where it's a dashboard that can be accessible. If not, is there a chance that people can be able to come up with one?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have not seen a centralized location where everybody feeds off of, right? There's pockets here and there. I know like APNIC do very good blogs about RPKI. Manners also has good blogs about, RPKI. NSRC also has a few, especially in terms of deployment or tutorials. So it's kind of all over the place. There's no central place. And I think one of the areas that suffers the most is actually what you described just now, Simon, which is, what software version works best with what scenario. That one is what is suffering the most. And that's just maybe a case of most people are not either not running RPKI yet, or are still too busy trying to deploy it. They don't have time to document their experiences or anything or something like that. So no central repository at the moment specifically for software revisions and the bugs you might find and whatnot. But yeah, many of locations where you can find where people are sharing experiences. And also, mind you, there's a lot of people out there that don't support RPKI. They think it's unnecessary. They think that it doesn't work. They think that it's a potential vector for attacks and so forth. So you also have that side. But every technology has those people. You have people that don't like MPLS, you have people that don't like IPv6, every technology has that. So you'll find a lot of information on RPKI in various ways. The thing is, the more you read up, number one, and the more you practice yourself, you will quickly begin to filter what works for you and what doesn't. So that would still be my encouragement, is that doing will lead you down the path where you get more information somehow that you can hopefully share with others, because then you have experience and you know what works for you and what doesn't, and also what questions to ask. And obviously, the mailing lists as usual, AFNOG, NANOG, AFPIF, SAFNOG, ZANOG, they all also are resources that you can take your questions to if you have any. There's a lot in the archives already. So yeah, it's a bit of a landmine at the moment. It's for navigating somehow. But there's always people you can ask. That's the thing. There's always people you can ask, and that's the good thing. That's the good thing.
Yeah, and you forgot and KeNOG as a mailing list.
And KeNOG, of course.
Yeah. So just in addition to that, Mark, especially now that you mentioned like Junos, now we're talking about like vendors. I think talking of these guys who do traffic mitigation for others, maybe just highlighting to people, especially the service that they normally try to be able to push you, that they may be able to originate for you. So if you are somebody that is focusing to be able to do like RPKI, that means there's a danger, right? That needs to be highlighted.
Yeah, so the good news with RPKI is that you can originate a prefix from multiple ASNs, right? So you can have prefix 1 being originated by ASN 100 and ASN 200, right? That's legal. It just means that each of those entries is its own ROA, right? So you'd have to create a ROA that is unique for that set. So you have a ROA that says prefix 1 can come from AS 100, prefix 1 can come from AS 200. That is perfectly legal. So if you have anybody who is announcing your prefixes on your behalf, then you can work around that by doing that. So that's perfectly legal. It's not a huge concern at all.
Thanks, Mark and Simon. Another anonymous question. What kind of specs does one need for the validator server? If you want to run your own validation server.
Yeah, so it's not, so if I look back, so like we are running ours on FreeBSD, literally any Unix or Linux is fine. I don't yet know of any validator that's run on Windows, but I know it's some kind of Linux or Unix. We run ours on FreeBSD. So OS-wise, any kind of Unix is fine. Server-wise, it's not even, any modern server is more than enough. The one we are using, I think the ones we are using at the moment, which we're going to be transitioning away from in a few weeks, were deployed in 2011. I think HP Gen 6s or Gen 7s or something or other. and they're still cooking. So you don't need a massive amount of resources. The RPKI one from RIPE, that one was a bit heavy. It used to crash quite a lot if you didn't have like at least 8 gig of RAM going towards it. So that one was a bit heavy, but that was just badly written. The current ones, Fort, Rotinator, Octo RPKI, RPKI plus stay RTR, those are all pretty light and they work really well. You might see a bit of CPU or RAM usage the first time when it has to validate for the first time, but incrementally, it's not a drama. Disk space, not a drama. So no, you don't need anything heavy. It will work on bare metal, it will work in a VM. Yeah, like we said, we're running ours on boxes from 2011 and they're still going. So you'll be fine with pretty much anything that's out there at the moment.
Great, thanks, Mark. I see another anonymous question. Does one need a license or authorization from ICANN, Afrinic, etc., to run RPKI?
Only for this. Oops, where am I going? Uh-oh, hold on. This is what happens when you don't know how to use things. Yeah, so only for this. So this is the only thing that you really need to think about, right? This is the Arion tile. And you need to think about that, when you accept to use the Arion tile, and obviously when your validator is downloading the Arion tile, it will actually ask you to explicitly say yes, that you agree to the RPA, the relying party agreement of Arion. That's the only thing where I think you need to, consider, another third party asking you to use their software or whatever you want to call it. Anything else? No. No, there's no license requirement at all to run any validator or to create a ROA or to run the router. It's only this is the only Arion thing where you'll be asked legally if you want to participate in the Arion tile.
Great. Thanks, Mark. I don't see any new questions. One final question from me, at least. So putting on my employer hat, I'm trying to work on some documentation for RPKI, and I run into Rotinator. And I see Rotinator, you need to manually refresh the cache. You need to put out a manual refresh for it to receive the new validated route information. Is there a standard practice for how many times you should do the refresh? Any best practice that is recommended? Or basically, how do you make sure that your Rotinator is having the most current information and you're not missing any valid routes that have just come into the cache? Is there a way you can plug that in remotely?
Are you running the latest Rotinator implementation?
Yes.
I think
yeah.
0.90.
Yeah.
I can't say I've come across that. Hang on a second. There's let me see if I can find it. There are some Rotinator issues that I'm just concerned about as well that have come up. Let me see if I can find them. What was that? Yeah, here we go. Let me see if I can just share that. So there's a couple of Rotinator issues. I think these are the ones that that I've found that are sort of making me rethink Rotinator as a valid validator going forward. And I'll just share the link in the chat so others can also have a look. There we go. Yeah, so this is one of the reasons that I'm looking at trying out RPKI Client plus stay RTR, because there's a lot of, I wouldn't say technical issues, but more philosophical issues that people have been having with RPK, with the Rotinator validator. I have not seen it not update VRPs, however. I mean, I've only been running it since 090. I haven't been using it before. I only began using it, I think, about a week and a half ago. So I've not noticed any need to manually resync it. So that's an interesting one. Are you seeing that the VRPs remain the same unless you do something manually?
Yeah, it's also on a test environment. So I was just curious if it's something, maybe there is something I need to do on my side. But just Googling at that time was like, you may need to do something manually to make sure it fetches the correct information. But this is on a test environment. I was just curious if it's something that is known, but I'll probably need to check my phone.
Yes, I mean, what we've seen, at least in the week and a half I've been running it, is that it seems to be refreshing quite nicely. The concern for me is these listed issues here that Europe was complaining about. So on that basis, I am going to be testing RPKI Client and stay RTR, which is why I say that you have to be flexible with the validators, because things happen all the time. Fort is generally okay and very well liked in the community, but I ran into a few issues with it as well in the last 3 weeks. One was a FreeBSD specific problem, which they managed to fix, but the code is not yet released officially, so it should be coming out in a few weeks. But a more critical one was the way it manages scaling for multiple servers, so obviously multiple clients. So like in our case, we have over 700 devices that need to connect to it, but it can only do threads for up to 500. So this is something that I talked about with them last night, actually, and they found out that they have to just change the concept of how they write the thread pool management code. So hopefully that comes out in about, in a couple of weeks, and that issue goes away. Other than that, Fort is pretty solid, and it's probably where we'll end up converging anyway, as it settles down, because what I'm finding is that most people who are running Fort either don't have it up and running fully yet, or if they are running it at low scale. So, not very many routers like we do, or are running it on Linux. So the issues that I've come across is because we're running it on FreeBSD and because we have a lot of routers. And Fort has been around for a long time. So apart from that, it's pretty good. So yeah, Rotinator, because of these issues, might not stay very long with us. The other one I'm talking about is, let me just write it here as well so that people get it. Because I thought I put it there, but clearly I forgot. Where is it here? Okay. So the one I'm talking about is called RPKI Client plus stay RTR. So that's the next one I'm going to be testing as well. And this one you can find in FreeBSD. So Rotinator and this one, RPKI Client, are in FreeBSD ports. Fort is a source install at the moment. It's not difficult, but it's a source install at the moment. But we are actually working with some friends. I don't know if Tony is on the call here. Tony Colombo, I asked him to help me create a make file so we can put it in the FreeBSD port. So he's thinking about it. Hopefully he'll say yes. So we can get Fort into the FreeBSD ports. But otherwise, you can install it from source. I think it's a direct install with Debian and Ubuntu and so forth. So it's not that hectic. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mark. There's one final question, an anonymous question. Question is, can ROAs be used to clean up stale IRR objects in Afinic as RIPE has implemented with RIPE 731? And what are the issues that can potentially be caused by this?
Yeah, I know RIPE began working on this, I think 2.5, maybe 3 years ago. To be honest, I haven't been following their progress. But yeah, I think it's an avenue worth exploring for Afrinic. Generally, the IRR database is full of, I'll just say, anonymous information, because anybody can create an IRR. It's not exactly secure, and there's a lot of junk in there. People come and go, who is contacts are, have changed, don't exist anymore. Like, I'm still getting emails where was a contact from another ISP back from 2003. Right. So yeah, I mean, it's one mechanism that you can use to authenticate the validity of data, and then sort of transfer that into the IRR for what it's worth. My hope, obviously, going forward is that we'll get to a point where we don't need an IRR anymore, and RPKI is the end all be all, but that could become a philosophical discussion. So that's for another day. But yeah, it's a mechanism that is quite sturdy, because the RPKI is extremely accurate, more so than the IRR. So I think this is obviously a question worth raising at the next Afrinic meeting, if I'm honest, just to sort of put them on the back foot and say, is this something that we can do as a community? And you don't have to wait until the next meeting. You can actually do it on the mailing list, the members' mailing list, or the community mailing list as well, and put them under pressure. But yeah, it's a great question, and obviously, I think a great opportunity for us to clean our stuff up as well. And I see Tony said he's working on it, so thank you very much, Tony. Appreciate that.
Great. I don't see any further questions, so we could probably thank Mark for taking time for sharing your knowledge and information on RPKI. It's been very informative. Really enjoyed that talk. I hope you'll share the slides with us. We'll share with the KeNOG mailing list and also the Signal group that we have. So thanks very much, sure, Mark, for that.
Let me PDF it and email it to you. Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate everybody spending the time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me just plug 2 events that will be of interest to the community. So next week is RPKI Week. It's being organized by Internet Society. Let me put the link on the chat, and then you can see how to register for that. So if you're interested in finding out more about RPKI, there'll be a week of several talks on RPKI and a chance to ask more questions. Of course, if you'd like to reach Mark, I'll invite you to join our mailing list and Signal group. If you go to this URL, https nog.ke, let me just put it on the chat.
Okay.
So this is our new look website. Thanks everyone who contributed to the information. So if you go to nog.ke, you will see a link to our Signal group, and you'll also see information about the next event, which is our Let's Encrypt automation tutorial, which will be led by Philip, who is a contractor and a FreeBSD committer. That would be on the 22nd of July, 2021, and you should be able to register for that from the website. So with that, thank you all. We'll share the slides once Mark sends them to us, and we look forward to having you at the next tutorial, which will be 22nd of July 2021 on automating Let's Encrypt. Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of the week. Thanks again, Mark, for taking time.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Bye.